Hey everybody! So, I left off on this part right here. We drove back to Mobridge. Mike Phillips and I went down to a local law office and asked the attorney if we could borrow the proper books to learn the procedure for appealing a judge's decision to the Supreme Court. We took them up on the house and, following the guidelines, wrote up the appeal, asking for a stay pending appeal. The next day, October 28th, 1982, I drove to McIntosh, and filed the appeal requesting a stay. Then I went to the sheriff's office and told Harry Kettleson about the appeal. After a short decision, we agreed that he would stop the counting of the cattle until the Supreme Court made its ruling. This would also give me a chance to contact our attorney. I went back to the ranch and called the PCA office in Timberlake. I talked to the office manager, Jim Harrelson, and told him about filing the appeal and stay pending appeal and what I had talked with the sheriff about. Harrison agreed they would wait until the Supreme Court made its ruling before they counted the cattle. I called Mr. Schluter, the attorney, explained to him all that had happened. We made tentative plans to meet Mobridge the following Wednesday, which would be the 3rd of November. He was trying to get in some flying time so he could complete the necessary requirements for pilot's license, and this would be a good opportunity. So, on the morning of November 3rd, Bill, my nephew, and I were doing the morning chores at the ranch yard when I noticed a gray pickup pulling a horse trailer start up on my driveway and stop. The pickup just sat there and waited. I went on with my work, and next time I looked towards the road, I saw the car coming in from north. It stopped beside the pickup and horse trailer for a brief time, and then together they proceeded up my driveway. Ooh. When they pulled up into the front of the house, I approached the car to see who was in it. It was a Sheriff Kittleson, and a man I did not recognize. Sheriff Kittleson asked me if I wanted to sit in the car out of the cold because they wanted to visit with me. And so I got into the back seat. Shortly, the men from the pickup got out of their vehicle and came over and got in the back seat with me. They were Jim Harrison and Jerry Holm from the PCA office in Timberlake. At this time, Harry introduced the other man in the front seat with him as Al Thorson from the PCA office in Le Mans. After a few minutes of small talk, they informed me that they were there to count the cattle, etc. I told them again that I had filed an appeal and a stay pending appeal. The sheriff spoke up and said that he knew that to be true because he had stopped that and checked that at the courthouse that morning. After some discussion, it was agreed by all that they could not count the cattle that day because of the pending appeal, and because I had a meeting with my attorney that afternoon at the Mobridge airport. So, they all agreed that I should have the opportunity to be there and help with the counting of the cattle. Harrison and Holm got out their car and got into their pickup and drove out of the yard. I visited a few more minutes with Sheriff Kittleson and Al Thorson when they also left. We finished chores and went to Mobridge. Judy was waiting for me at the house since it happened to be her day off from work. Okay, so she told Mr. Schluter he had to stay. The wind was so strong that he would have to postpone our appointment for one more day. So I did have some business matters to take care of in Selby, 20 miles east of Mobridge. So I decided to do that and not waste the trip. After I got to Selby, and had stopped at the elevator, they told me Judy had called, and I was to call her as soon as I got there. Jerry Holm had just called her and wanted to know where I was. So she told him I wasn't there at the moment. Jerry said to give me a message. They were going back out to the ranch and to count the cattle, the hay, and the machinery. So, Judy reminded him that was contrary to the judge's order and that we had an appeal filed and also a stay pending appeal. Jerry said he didn't care. They didn't care. They had arranged their schedule to do it that afternoon, and they were going to go out ahead and do it. Judy argued again, saying, you can't. You don't even know where all the cattle are, and you can't get an accurate count without one of us there to help. Jerry said he'd get back to her and hung up. In a little bit, he called again. This time he told Judy they had a conference with Ron Johnson, Judge Chetter, and at their office. That judge said an appeal could take weeks. So if they wanted to count Dale's stuff to go right ahead, that was what they were going to have to do. Judy told him, Jerry, you can't. You'll be breaking the law. To this, Jerry replied, the judge said we could go and we're going to do it. And if Byron isn't there, I guess that's just too bad. Judy said, Jerry, someday you're going to have to stand before a great white throne, and what excuse are you going to have then? Are you going to say PCA made me do it? Jerry hung up on her. She then called Selby, and by this time I had arrived. I told her I could not leave right then, but as soon as I finished my business, I would come straight to the house at Mowbridge. Upon returning, I stopped in Mowbridge and talked things over with Judy. Then she headed straight to the ranch. When I had arrived at the ranch, I was met by my nephew, Bill Dale. Bill was staying there with me, but had gone down to my dad's place that afternoon to help him, and just arrived back at the ranch a few minutes before I got there. Bill said he didn't know what on earth had happened that day, but all the electric fences went down in the middle of the bunks where they were torn down. A lot of calves were lame, and there was a dead calf in one of the lots. I took a quick look, and sure enough, all the electric fences were in the middle of the bunks. They were ripped out. The cattle were all limping and coughing as if they had been chased, and there was dead calves in the small lot. It took as though I had been trampled. They'd all been trampled. This calf has been trampled. And I ran to the house and called Sheriff Kittleson. His wife answered the phone. I asked for Harry, and she said she was at my place. I said, where was I when Harry wasn't there? So she contacted him on his car radio. She said he was between my place and McIntosh. So she said she had supper ready, and as soon as Harry had eaten, they'd come up to my ranch. Later I learned that Al Thorson was still with him, and he took him into McIntosh before he came to my place. In about 2 hours, Harry and his wife came to my place and inspected the damage. So when we went to the house, he had a long discussion about what had happened that day and the events leading up to it. Alright, so the next day, my lawyer, Frank Schluter, flew into Mowbridge. We had a long session. On November 9th, Sheriff Kittleson drove into the yard and served more papers on me, after which he drove to Mowbridge and served the same papers on Judy, which is like, come on, man. The next day, I drove to Huron to confer with Frank and stayed in Huron and worked with him all week and tried to learn how this legal process worked. On November 15th, Frank Schluter received his copy of the papers the sheriff had served on Judy and me. The next morning, Frank called Ron Johnson, PCA's attorney, and Judge Chetter, and asked for a continuance because of the short time that he had to prepare. Chetter told him, no deal, that we'd better be in court at 8 sharp, or they would proceed without us. So Frank and I worked all day and then drove all night so that we could be sure to be in court by 8 a.m. sharp. Ron Johnson didn't show up until 9 o'clock, so we had to wait an hour for him. I just think that's funny. Okay, it was at this hearing that we found out that what really happened at our ranch that day. The PCA came out and I wasn't home. It seems they had a small army Corson County Sheriff, Dewey County Sheriff, one highway patrolman, and Tom Maupin, special investigator for the SD Bren Board, plus the PCA officers. They had to come to my place and inspect everything that we owned. He stated how they had entered the corrals and ran up the cattle from one end to the other trying to count them. This made the cattle very nervous. They kept running around, and they weren't sure what the count was. They went through the barns, counted haystacks, and looked over my machinery. The PCA had never been interested in one thing I had before I paid them off with the same thing they had loaned me, which was bookkeeping entries created out of thin air. Only mine were backed with something, my crops, which is more than PCA can claim. That's hilarious. Jerry Holm then stated that they could not locate 51 head of young cows that he thought we had, although there was no such cattle listed on the security agreement on his affidavit. He stated that he knew we had some leased pastures to the south and to the west, but there was not sufficient light to check those pastures that day. Then he went on in his affidavit to say that on August 20, 1982, he had been in our home and we told him that we had decided to contest the PCA, the FLB, and the FMHA loans. To this day, they have refused to face the issue of what is money, or what is tender, according to the United States Constitution, and what the state of South Dakota can force a person to use against his will and over objections as to the medium of exchange, pursuant to Article 1, Section 10 of the United States Constitution. Jim Harrison's affidavit testified that they could not find 51 head of cattle, but prior to inspection of November 3, 1982, PCA had no information of loss or shortage of livestock security or grounds within the security agreement for declaring default or acceleration of the security agreement prior to the due date of December 1st, 1982. Now remember, this was on November 17th, right? So, but because of Jim Harrison's and Jerry Holmes' affidavits, they assumed that the 51 head of cattle were missing. They insinuated that this honest, law-abiding couple, Judy and I, surely must have stolen them. And even though they admitted in their own affidavits that they hadn't looked in all the pastures, and there were no such cattle listed in any PCA reports, regardless, Judge Cheddar granted Johnson's request and put a restraining order on us. So we couldn't sell anything, not even to buy food or pay electricity bill or phone bill or any other obligation we might have. Wow. So, I mean, that's total tyranny, man. Previous to this experience, the only time I had been in court was over a traffic ticket, and Judy had never been in court before. We just couldn't believe what was happening to us. The court would not address the issues of what PCA had loaned or any facts regarding the Constitution or what was or was not legal tender in payment of debts. They just treated us as no-account citizens who were surly criminals and had to be punished. Punished? For what? We couldn't figure it out. Well, it's because the Federal Reserve's private. That's why. And it's offshore, and it's run for profit. That's why. Every piece of property we had listed on the security agreement was in our possession, was in good repair and in good health. Our intention was not to get away with anything, but to simply address the issues of what looked to us like a giant fraud. And we were the victims. We wanted to address this issue in its proper place, a court of law, and have the issue decided before a jury once and for all. This was not going to be in the chain of events that were to happen to us. Okay, so the more I thought about what happened, the more I was sure I didn't have all the information about what exactly did happen at the ranch. Uh, on the afternoon of November 3rd, we just didn't know what happened. So the next time I was in McIntosh, I asked Harry Kittleson for a copy of his written report covering the incident. After reading it, I began to see how they play their games. The conspiracy to take our ranch became abundantly clear. Harry's written report went like this. On the morning of November 3rd, 1982, Al Thorson arrived a little before 8 a.m., and we headed for Dale Farm. We met Jerry Holm and James Harrison on the road by Dale Farm, in their pickup pulling a horse trailer with 3 saddle horses in the trailer. I took the lead and drove into the Dale Farm with Al Thorson, with Holm and Harrison. Following in the pickup, we stopped just east of the house. I saw Dale on foot, the corrals, with Bill Dale, Byron's nephew, driving the tractor with some kind of trailer behind it. That's probably a lawnmower. Byron Dale came right over to the car and got him into the rear seat. I looked around and saw that Jerry Holm had parked his pickup in the lane to the farm home, and that he and Harrison were walking towards my car too, and they got in the back seat with Byron Dale. Byron then asked what was going on. And then I said that the plans were to take count of the cattle and feed, etc. Then Dale, quote, then Dale said that we were not to count the cattle, and that he had not gotten to see his attorney yet, that he should have the right to at least talk with his attorney. Then one of the fellows said that they had gone to the court order giving them the right to count the cattle. They had the court order. Then Dale said that he filed an appeal to the judge's order that he made in court. Also, that he did not have an attorney in court to represent him, and that he should have the right to at least talk to an attorney before anything was done. So then Holm and Harrison told Dale that they were not going to do any arguing, but guessed that he had better go downtown and do some calling. Dale said that he had talked with the attorney about an appointment for November 3rd, and that with weather permitting, the attorney wanted to get in some flying time, so he would fly to Mobridge to confirm with him there. But if the weather was such that one could not fly, then he, Dale, would have to drive to Huron. So we all left, went to the PCA office in Timberlake. When I say all, I mean the PCA fellows and myself, where Harrison and the Holm did some calling on the phone. After a time, a telephone circuit was set up whereby attorney Judge Chetter, one of the PCA boys at Timberlake, and myself were all on separate phones. Okay. I have tried to call the judge a couple of times and was always told that he could not talk to me unless the other parties of the action were present. Yet it seems that Ron Johnson and PCA had a direct pipeline to the judge. Apparently, they can call him any time and discuss their plan of action, bypassing lawful court procedure. Our next court date was November 17th, 1982. It was at this hearing that PCA attorney Ron Johnson began handing us new filings when we got to the court. On this date, he gave up his First Amendment and supplement to the original complaint. He amended and supplemented it so many times that to this day no one knows for sure the proper sequence of events. Half the time, the amended complaints weren't dated, etc., adding to the confusion of the whole sordid mess. What an ordeal, man. Seriously, they just try to get all this bureaucracy in there to screw people over. That's all it is. That's all I'm talking about here. Don't be confused here. They had set a new date to count the cattle. this time with the promise of no changes, and we all would be there. My lawyer, Frank Schluter, was at the hearing. They put me on the stand and tried to get me confused and say that I had sold mortgage property. Property. As you will see later in the story, all the property was there when they later sold it. So how could I testify that I had sold any mortgage property when it was all still there? They even had the state's attorney there ready to press charges and put me away. Jeez. After 4 hours of interrogation, they finally gave up. Okay. The week before the new cattle count, I again went to Huron to work on this case with Mr. Schluter. Okay, so the day I left to go home, he loaned me his video camera so I could film the count. The way things were going, we felt we needed this indisputable evidence. That's smart. Seriously, that's great. The day of the second count was a beautiful day. We had to wait 2 hours for the state brand inspector to show up, but this didn't seem to upset anyone very much. Judy set up the VCR recorder, and we filed the cattle. We filed the cattle past slowly. It's hard to read that. It's a typo. One by one, when I was there to organize the count, the cattle didn't get all riled up, and we got an accurate count of the first time through. After counting the calves from the lots at the corrals, we loaded our horses and went down to the big pasture where the cows were. There was our son, Corey, nephew Bill, Judy, Tom Maupin, the state brand inspector, Jerry Holm, and Jim Harrison from PCA, all mounted on horses. Wow. We swept the pasture and herded the cows down to the lower southwest corner. The high bank creek gave them a natural barrier. So all we had to do was position Tom at the edge of the brush, string the cattle along in front of him. Judy went across the creek and set up the VCR on the hilltop. With the camera zoom lens, she zoomed in and got an excellent movie of the count. Knowing the terrain and how to handle cattle as I didn't take long, and we had an accurate count. PCA had used the false affidavits, of Holm and Harrison to put a restraining order on us, so we couldn't use any of our property to pay our due accounts. They accused us of disposing of mortgage property, but after I was beaten up and they had sold all the cattle, the market ticket proved that they were 326 head of cattle in the pasture, and they only had a security agreement on 260. So all the machinery was there with all the hay. You would think that this would exonerate us with the court, stop the action by PCA, and return us to the ranks of respectable citizens. Wrong! At the at our very next hearing, December 8th, Johnson tried to make out that we were hardened criminals, actually. It seemed there weren't as many calves as he thought there should have been. It doesn't matter that there were more cows that were listed on the books. We had accounted to the court for every cow we had handled. Confronted with this, the only way for Johnson to try to save face was to fabricate a situation and try to make us look as though we were guilty of some act of misconduct. Anything. By this time, Judy and I were in a state of shock. We couldn't believe that we were in an American court dealing with an American judicial system. We felt at the beginning that if we could get our evidence into the courts, we had the PC stopped. We would get them stopped. And that the courts would have no choice but to rule in our favor. Boy, were we wrong. If we even mentioned the United States Constitution, It's like a faded ink right here. If we ever mention the United States Constitution, the CCP something, the communication broke down immediately. Sorry, it's like missing ink here. It's obvious. Let me read that again. If we even mention the United States Constitution, the communication broke down immediately, that's crazy. So it is obvious that the judge was ignoring his oath to uphold the Constitution. Just right there. This is what's going on in America. The Constitution is treated like George Bush said, a GD piece of paper. It's just a GD piece of paper. Freaking George W. Bush. A few months before our shocking experience in court, we had met a farm couple, Ivan and Wilma Felt. Together we had turned everywhere looking for help to fight dishonest money system that enabled the bankers to take over America. Ivan and Wilma were facing farm foreclosure because the bank had suddenly demanded more collateral. So the Felts refused and the bank foreclosed. Every place we turned, they told us, "We're sorry. We just can't help you or give you any advice. You must see an attorney." But every attorney we ever talked to said that he could not help us because his biggest client was a bank or other lending institution. In fact, it was through Ivan and Wilma that I met attorney Frank Schluter. Schluter did seem to sincerely try to help us, but all came to an end after December 8th hearing. It seems Schluter went to the bank and had been doing his business for a long time and asked for a loan. He was turned down. It was a way of telling him to stop trying to help certain money protesters. Us. Once when I went to see Attorney General of the state of South Dakota, I was referred to an aide named Dennis Holmes. I asked him if he would look up a few laws for me and check to see if those laws were still current. He looked up all the laws and told me that indeed they were current. But he could not help me because he did not want to get involved in my politics. It's politricks, man. It's not politics. That same day, when I was in the Capitol building in Pierre, I met a newspaper man. We had a long visit during which time I shared my findings about the money system, its fraud, and my fight to keep my ranch. Soon after this, my plight hit the press. Boom. That's nice. One lengthy article that appeared in the Rapid City Journal covered 1/3 of the front page. Another 1/3 page continued on page 2. Through my association with Ivan and Wilma Felt, I met Rusty Koba, a man who, like ourselves, was trying to stop abuse by the banks, courts, and other government agendas. So one day he called and said that he was at the Felt farm and he was on his way to Ashley, North Dakota for a meeting that evening, and said that he was going right back to my place. Would stop there to pick me up, and if I would like to go along, I was eager to meet other patriots. So I went along. I was at this meeting when I met Mike Phillips and Jim Coleman for the first time. Jim Coleman was battling the IRS, and Mike was working for them. This was my first encounter with someone who believed the IRS was just another one of the banksters, one of their tools to steal money from the working middle class. I added banksters, by the way. Through my association with him, I met Dave Broer, Broer, Dave Broer. Dave was sincere in his beliefs and had fully realized the fraud and theft taking place in our money system. He became a special friend, and we spent considerable time studying my situation and what to do next. By then, we had enough papers served on us so that we had an idea of how to motion up for a hearing. We had moved for a dismissal and set a time and date for a hearing on our motion. I wrote the following follow-up brief in support to the hearing date was set for January 6th. I meant to say I wrote the follow-up brief in support. The hearing date was set for January 6th. Late Monday night, January 3rd, 1983, someone rang our doorbell. I opened the door, and there stood a nice-looking, dark-haired man who introduced himself as Scott Fowl, F-A-U-L. He said that he was a friend of Dave Brower, who had talked highly of me. He had a couple of friends in the car and asked if they could come in and wanted to meet me. So I said, sure, they're more than welcome. And then when they all got in the house, Scott introduced them. The elderly man was Gordon Call, and the young fellow was his son, Yorty. They explained that they were on their way to Campo, Colorado, to attend the Jerry Wright foreclosure sale. So, I'm just seeing if it's still recording. Yeah, I have like 47 minutes. It just cuts out, so I'm going to keep going. So he went to the Jerry Wright foreclosure sale. That's where they were going, in Campo, Colorado. We talked about farm foreclosure and how the Federal Reserve debt money and the banking system greed was the root of our personal and our nation's problems. We talked about an hour or so, and then they left. They said if we had time, they would stop on their way back. I visited them to stop at the ranch, or I invited them to stop at the ranch since that was where I would be. They did stop. This time, we had a day or so to visit. Gordon and Scott began to tell us some of the things that they had experienced at the hands of corrupt government officials and what happens to the other people they know. Gordon told how the feds had tried to kill him twice, once by tampering with his airplane and once by putting a drug in his food to cause a heart attack. This was a while he had in prison on IRS charge. Luckily, he got out alive. Wow, that's insane. That sounds familiar though. As we talked about my hearing coming up on the 6th of January, they said that they would stay in, go to the hearing with me. During the hearing, I used the example of a poker game to explain our debt money system. I told Judge Cheddar, let's have a poker game. We'll have 10 men in the game and loan each man 10 chips. Alright, then would make a total of 100 chips in the game. Each man would then be charged 10% interest. So, of the men will have good games and win, and some would lose. But when the game is over, each man in the game would owe 11 chips. 10 chips for the principal, and 1 for the interest. This would mean that 110 chips would have to come out of the game, or the players would lose their property, which they had put up for collateral. As you can see, this is an impossible situation, since only 100 chips were loaned into the game. It is impossible to pay back 110 chips if you only loan out 100. SDCL 22. I'm going to repeat that again. SDCL 20-2-2 states a condition in a contract, the fulfillment of which is impossible or unlawful, or which is repugnant to the nature of the interest created by the contract, is void. When I quoted that, the judge got beet red and the PCA attorney turned white. At the end of the hearing, Judge Cheddar said he would take it under advisement within a couple of weeks. He ruled against me and proceeded to foreclose on me, just like they apparently had planned from the beginning. We tried to enlist the help of the news media. So, after our disastrous experience in court, it was clear that the court was not going to face the money issue or follow up the law in any way. So I began to try to get all the press I could on the debt money system and what it is, what's it doing in our nation. Why do we have a central bank, guys? Why do we have a central bank? Why do they get to just say whatever they... it's so frustrating once you see this problem. Alright, so a man I knew, a doctor from Aberdeen, South Dakota, called and said he had heard about my situation and wondered if he could do anything to help me. I told him about a hearing I had coming up and would like to have the press cover it so that they could see and report to the people how one-sided the courts are. I tried and tried to get the press to cover the hearing, but was ignored. The doctor agreed to give them a call. A few days later, several reporters called me. The first to call was a lady reporter from Aberdeen American News. She wanted to know what was going on. At first, she was very indifferent. We talked for some time, and I challenged her to look up a few of the things that I told her and check in to see if I was correct. A few days later, she called me back and said there was no question I was correct, but she couldn't cover my story. She refused to give a reason. Obviously, people are being blackballed. The next one to call was a woman from the TV station in Rapid City. She had called to tell me that she thought I was nuts. I told her she was entitled to her opinion, but before she judged me, she should at least listen to what I had to say. I mean, come on, lady. At the end of our conversation, she admitted that I did make a lot of sense. She agreed to send someone out to cover the story. She kept her word. A crew did appear and cover the hearing. The last one to call was a farm reporter, Al Guston, for a TV station in Bismarck, North Dakota. I had stopped at his farm the previous summer and had a long visit. I had left several books with him and promised to research them. He returned the books after several weeks and said he could understand what I was saying, but that the problem was too big for the two of us to handle, and neither of us had enough money to push it in court. Man, people just give up before they start. That's the problem here. That's the problem with America. We just gave up before we even tried to occupy the Federal Reserve. We were discussing this over the phone, and after we had visited a while, he said, "Why do you have to be in such a stiff-necked..." I can't say that word. "Why do you have to be such a stiff-necked blah blah?" Cuss word. "Why can't you go along with everyone else?" And hung up. Go along with fraud? After the January 6th hearing, which was covered by a TV crew from Rapid City, I began to get quite a few calls and was invited to speak in a few places. One of the places was a small town east of Rapid City. This meeting was on Saturday night, January 22nd, 1983. It was there I first met with Gordon Johnson, a reporter from Rapid City Journal. When the question and answer period came after I was through speaking, Gordon spoke up, and I said he had studied economics in college and that I was all wrong. 4 or 5 others spoke up and said they all agreed with me. But finally, one rather large man spoke up and said that since he had been laid up and couldn't work for about a year, he had studied this situation extensively and was more than positive I was right. After this, the reporter Gordon Johnson seemed a little more willing to listen. He asked me to recommend reputable literature for him to read on the subject. I loaned him the book titled Truth in Money by Theodore R. Theron and Richard F. Warner. I also gave him Ted's phone number. I told him after he read the book to give me a call and we would discuss it further. So let me leave it there because that's 40 minutes. But yeah, I'll just keep going. I'll do the rest today.